All right, so we talked about the determinants of clearance, and we came up with Q times blood flow times extraction ratio, so Q times E. And then we said, well, what determines its extraction ratio? We kind of understand what determines blood flow. Blood flow is, depends upon the heart rate and the stroke volume, or cardiac output and resistance, I'm sorry. Anyway, so your blood flow is sort of easy to understand. Now, your extraction ratio is a little harder. So what determines extraction ratio? Well, we went through that in the last slide group. So extraction ratio is equal to, I should be writing this down. I'm going to do that. So clearance is equal to Q times E. So we kind of get what Q is about. But what's E about? Well, E is equal to intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound all over Q plus intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound. And depending upon whether we have a high or low extraction drug, so if it's a high extraction drug, then Q becomes the rate limiting step, so it falls out of the equation, and then E becomes approximately equal to 1 for a high extraction drug. But for a low extraction drug, how do I get this bigger? For a low extraction drug, E is equal to intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound all over Q plus intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound. But in this case, intrinsic clearance is the rate limiting step, so it falls out of the equation. And we have E is equal to intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound all over Q. And then we can multiply E times Q, and then we have for a high extraction drug, this is for low, for a high extraction drug, I should have done this on a separate sheet of paper. Maybe I will do that again. Let me try. Problem is I can't ever figure out how to get back, can I? Alright, let's see. Okay, I'm going to start this all over again. So, we all know that clearance is equal to Q times E. Q is well understood. E, we know, is equal to, this is according to the well-stirred jar model. I decided to drop that understanding that well-stirred jar, but just go with me here, that we're going to assume that E is dependent upon the intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound all over blood flow plus intrinsic clearance times the fraction unbound. So if we have a high extraction drug, then Q is the rate limiting step. So with high extraction, Q falls out, and our E is equal to 1, approximately equal to 1. Therefore, clearance will be Q times E, and if E is approximately equal to 1, then clearance is approximately equal to Q. So for a high extraction drug, clearance is dependent upon Q. If we have a low extraction drug, here the intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound is the rate limiting step. So it falls out of this equation, and E is approximated by intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound all over Q. It's not as simple as this one, is it? But then if we multiply Q times that, Q times intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound all over Q, those Q's will cancel, and we have clearance is approximated by intrinsic clearance times fraction unbound. So going back here to the high extraction drug, we have a pretty good idea of what determines blood flow, right? It's heart rate and resistance, stroke volume. Whereas clearance, and we also know what determines binding. We just went over that in our last section on volumes of binding. What we don't really understand is what determines intrinsic clearance. And that's what we're going to be doing in this slide set. How come I can't remember what I'm doing again with this? It was from last time. Okay. All right. So intrinsic clearance. What determines intrinsic clearance? Recall that intrinsic clearance is defined as the theoretical, oopsie, okay, I'm still struggling here, and I'm still struggling. There we go. It's the theoretical drug clearance of an organ. So it's the actual intrinsic within itself when there's no blood flow and no protein binding holding it back. So it's the intrinsic ability of the organ to eliminate drug. So none of these things are going to be getting in the way. It's all about the innate ability of the organ to eliminate drug. I will tell you, I think of this, if we think about hepatic clearance, hepatic clearance, the intrinsic ability or the intrinsic clearance of the liver are the enzymes. It's the enzyme activity in the liver. We'll talk more about intrinsic clearance in different areas later. But intrinsic clearance. Okay, so we're going to go forward. One slide. So hepatic clearance. We just talked about hepatic clearance. Hepatic clearance, if, like I said, when I think of intrinsic clearance for the liver, I think of the enzyme activity in the liver and the hepatic enzymes. Now, what determines that? Here's our intrinsic clearance. It is equal to Vmax over Km plus C. What does this remind you of? Hopefully Michaelis-Menten. Yay! Good old Michaelis-Menten. So Vmax, remember, is the velocity or the rate, the maximum rate at which this interaction can occur. Km is your Michaelis-Menten constant, and C is your concentration of drug. So Vmax in this case are the number of enzymes available to metabolize the drug. So it's the capacity of the system. Vmax is always a measure of the capacity of the system, and Km is the concentration where you achieve half of Vmax, right? So if Km is a concentration where you have half of Vmax, it is a measure of your affinity. The higher the Km, the lower the affinity, and vice versa. The lower the Km, the higher the affinity. So another Michaelis-Menten situation. We've got quite a few of them now, right? Binding is dependent upon Michaelis-Menten. Now, liver enzyme or intrinsic clearance for hepatic clearance is dependent upon Michaelis-Menten. We also have renal tubular secretion, so the intrinsic clearance of tubular secretion in the kidney is the intrinsic clearance of the secretion in the kidney is dependent upon Tmax, which is the number of transport sites in the proximal tubule that will move drug, And KTS, again, is a Michaelis-Menten constant, which is the concentration where you have half of your transport sites full. And then, of course, concentration. So you can see it's these same themes with Michaelis-Menten again and again and again. So if you understand Michaelis-Menten, you understand all of this stuff, which is super exciting. So spend your time with Michaelis-Menten. That's all we have for this one. All right, see you again soon. Bye-bye.